Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine you step into an online arena, right, where minds clash, not with fists, obviously, but with logic, definitions, and, well, sometimes outright deception.
Mm-hmm.
Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into a recent Discord channel debate, aptly dubbed Burden on Who.
Yeah, that name definitely stuck.
It really did. And what started as, a seemingly simple question about religious claims, it just quickly spiraled. It became this foundational argument about the very rules of discussion, even the nature of atheism itself.
What's truly fascinating here, I think, is observing how quickly these foundational disagreements, especially around definitions, like you said, and just basic logical principles, how fast they can derail any meaningful exchange.
Simply.
So our mission today is to pull back the curtain on these intricate dynamics. We want to show you not just what was said, but how it was said, and perhaps most importantly, why those particular conversational tactics mattered so much to the outcome.
Right. It's kind of a masterclass in discerning truth from just tactical maneuvering.
Exactly. And it offers, I think, invaluable lessons on why so many of these online intellectual clashes just go completely off the rails.
And for this deep dive, we've got some incredibly rich source material. We've gone through detailed chat logs, detailed capturing every nuance of the exchange.
Right, yeah. Hours of reading there.
For sure. And in-depth analyses of the participants, their specific debating tactics, and even an academic review that meticulously breaks down the logical fallacies at play.
So you're about to get a unique shortcut, really, to understanding this complex, often frustrating, but sometimes actually surprisingly illuminating world of online philosophical debate.
Yeah, it's about empowering you, the listener, to recognize these patterns when you encounter them yourself, because you probably will.
You definitely will.
So let's set the stage, shall we? Our arena for today's intellectual gladiatorial contest is a Discord channel, specifically dedicated to atheism. Now, it's important to understand this isn't just a place for casual chat, right? It's designed for genuine inquiry. It's supposed to be a space where people can explore different perspectives, religion, philosophy, personal beliefs, hopefully in a reasoned manner.
Supposedly, yeah.
The ideal, anyway.
Exactly, the ideal. But as with any forum built for intense intellectual discussion, especially on deeply held beliefs, well, it can also become a hotspot for heated conflict.
And conflict it certainly became in this case.
Oh, absolutely.
Indeed. And the core of this particular firestorm revolved around a few key players. Each brought their own distinct perspectives, their own styles to the table.
Let's introduce them.
Okay, first up, we had Wolf Fangs, identified as Sikh. He's the one who initiated the entire discussion. Our analysis suggests he started out curious, genuinely asking, but he quickly became defensive as the debate progressed.
That happens a lot, doesn't it?
It does. Then there was AV42, an atheist. They laid down one of the first crucial skeptical principles we'll talk about.
We also had dodecahedron, identified as agnostic. They offered a very pragmatic, often skeptical viewpoint, really focusing on the practical implications of the claims being made.
Sort of the reality check person?
Kind of, yeah. But the true central figure, and what we might call the enforcer of logical rigor, was Kitani, an atheist. Her assertive, meticulously detailed arguments became the absolute focal point of the pushback against what she saw as bad faith tactics.
She sounds like the anchor in the storm.
In many ways, yes. Then, on the other side, entering later to significantly disrupt the flow, was Ieschouah 33, identified as Gnostic. He consistently, almost relentlessly, shifted the debate to, well, a fundamentally flawed understanding of the burden of proof. We'll get deep into that.
Oh, I bet we will.
And we also saw interventions from Novari LVX, identified as part of the mod team, from another religious background. They stepped in repeatedly to try and clarify basic logic and, moderate the increasingly heated exchange.
A thankless job sometimes.
Often. And finally, Willow M, identified as a Fatanist, who often aligned with the logical points made by Kitani and Novari, which is interesting, right? It shows how logical consistency can sometimes transcend individual belief systems.
That is interesting. Different viewpoints united by logic.
Precisely.
So what was the initial spark? You said Wolf Fangs started it.
He did. The initial spark for this whole saga, which, believe me, unraveled over days, was a seemingly innocuous question from Wolf Fangs. This was July 20, 2025, 4:25 a.m., according to the logs.
Okay, early morning debate.
Yep. He asked, and I quote, "What do atheists think of religions using scientific claims through divine revelation as evidence of that religion being true?"
Okay, on the surface, that sounds like a perfectly fair, open-ended question, doesn't it? Like, designed to invite a thoughtful discussion.
You'd think so. But what started as a seemingly academic inquiry, well, it quickly became anything but. It really revealed these deeper currents of miscommunication and, frankly, tactical maneuvers.
Okay, so let's dive into that first arc. Wolf Fangs' initial inquiry. He's asking how atheists perceive religions claiming these scientific claims through divine revelation that get verified later. Is that evidence?
Yeah, that was the core of it. He wanted to know if that counts as valid proof for religion's truth. He then followed up, asking if eyewitness and written testimony could be considered sufficient evidence for these kinds of claims.
Okay, so he's bringing in testimony as well.
Right, and AV42, one of the first atheists to respond, quickly pushed back on that testimony idea. As you pointed out, look, while testimony might hold up in, say, a court of law today, its reliability becomes incredibly difficult to assess over vast stretches of time.
Makes sense. You can't cross-examine someone from 2,000 years ago.
Exactly. You can't judge their credibility directly. Wolf Fangs then proposed this process of elimination idea. He suggested, well, if science debunks a specific religious claim, then that religion can't be the true religion. He was trying to set up a kind of binary, either the claims hold up scientifically or the religion is just false.
A simple test in his mind.
Seemingly. But that's where dodecahedron, the agnostic, chimed in with a really pragmatic and, I thought, quite insightful, skeptical response.
What did they say?
They highlighted the sheer number of religions making similar sorts of claims, pointing out that, logically, they can't all be true.
Right, the exclusivity problem.
Exactly. And this process of elimination idea, while it sounds logical on the surface, gets incredibly tricky when you consider the thousands of religions and denominations, each with its own set of claims. How do you even start?
Yeah, it's overwhelming.
And dodecahedron also introduced the crucial possibility that, hey, maybe all of them are wrong. That's always on the table. They also raised the point that many of these seemingly correct ancient claims could just be, well, coincidental observations.
Or just vague interpretations.
Precisely. Vague interpretations that people then retrospectively retrofit to modern scientific understanding rather than them being actual divine insights from the start.
That's a really key skeptical point, the retrofitting.
It absolutely is. And it immediately sets the stage for the kind of evidence being discussed and the standards of proof that would need to be applied. Then, Kitani joined the conversation.
Okay, the enforcer arrives.
Yeah. And her first contribution was this comprehensive rebuttal, focusing heavily on definitional precision, which, as you'll see, becomes a recurring and absolutely vital theme in her approach.
So, definitions first.
Always, for her. She clearly articulated religions do not make scientific claims. They make claims about the world that may be empirically tested.
Okay, that's a subtle but important distinction.
It's profound, really. She stressed that religious claims are not derived from the scientific method, hypothesis, experiment, observation, peer review. Instead, she called them religious conjecture.
Conjecture, not science.
Right. And this distinction is vital because it separates an observable, testable hypothesis from a revelation that's just claimed to be divine. Different categories entirely.
And her point was, even if some of these religious conjectures, these guesses, turn out to be correct later on.
Exactly. And she gave examples like you might find claims in ancient texts about all life is from water, or observations that certain water bodies don't mix.
Things people could have just observed, maybe.
That was precisely her argument. Even if those specific conjectures are correct, it still doesn't validate the entire religion, especially when other claims from that same religion are, as she put it, demonstrably false, empirically verifiable.
Right, you can't cherry pick the hits and ignore the misses.
You can't. That's a crucial logical leap that many proponents of these scientific miracles often just gloss over. She then offered perfectly plausible, non-divine explanations for these correct conjectures, like simple human observation.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. Humans could observe that different bodies of water don't always seem to mix readily, maybe where a river meets the sea, or that life absolutely needs water to survive. You don't need a supernatural memo for that.
Exactly. It's an everyday observation, potentially, not some secret revelation pulled from the ether.
So the standard of proof is much higher than just finding a correlation.
That's what Kitani was pressing. This raises an important question she was forcing. When does a correct guess, or a simple human observation, even if it's written down in an ancient text, suddenly transform into divine revelation?
Yeah, where's that line?
Kitani points out that humans can observe things like water bodies not mixing, or the necessity of water for life, without needing a supernatural explanation for that observation to be accurate. The logical leap from an observed phenomenon, even recorded anciently, to it being divine revelation, that's precisely where the skepticism lies. It's a fundamentally different standard of evidence than what Wolf Fangs seemed to be implying.
And Kitani was insisting on this higher, more rigorous standard.
Absolutely. Which leads us to where it gets really interesting. The first major derailment. A classic bad faith tactic exposed.
Okay, what happened?
Wolf Fangs, seemingly trying to invalidate Kitani's entire comprehensive argument and maybe shift the burden of his own unclear question, he attempted to retroactively reframe his original inquiry.
He changed his question after the fact.
Essentially, yes. He claimed, and I quote the logs again, "Okay, but if a religion makes only true, empirically verifiable claims, that was my question." Then he accused Kitani of basing her reasoning off continued assumptions, trying to dismiss her whole response.
Wow. Okay, that's bold.
Bold is one word for it. Kitani's response was immediate and honestly surgically precise. She didn't just push back, she provided the digital receipts.
She quoted him.
Side by side, she quoted his original, much more general question, and then put his new, highly specific hypothetical right next to it. Exposed the change clear as day.
Oof. That's a takedown.
It was. And it wasn't just a clumsy misstep by Wolf Fangs. It felt like a classic maneuver to invalidate an opponent's argument. And you can't defeat the message, attack the premise, even if you have to rewrite history to do it.
So he tried to put her on the defensive by blaming her for misunderstanding a question he never actually asked in that form.
Exactly. It's a hallmark of bad faith behavior you see online all the time. Trying to rewrite the narrative to suit your argument after the fact.
But what's remarkable, you said, is that Kitani still answered him, even after calling out the lie.
Yes, and this is a testament, I think, to her commitment to good faith debate, despite the provocation. Even after meticulously fact-checking him and exposing the dishonesty, she still, in good faith, proceeded to answer his modified hypothetical.
Wow, okay.
She argued that even in that scenario, a hypothetical religion making only true, empirically verifiable claims, it still wouldn't necessarily prove divinity. Her point, again, was that human inference, observation, even just accidental correctness, could lead to these correct conjectures without any divine intervention needed.
So she refused to be derailed from the core logical point, even when faced with that kind of behavior.
She did. But Wolf Fangs didn't let it go. He continued to accuse Kitani of going on a tangent and bizarrely unfairly referencing Islam. He complained that she gave examples like, life is from water, even though he hadn't named a specific religion. He said, I merely asked, what do you think of that argument in itself? Not for you to reference Islam and argue Islam is false.
But examples are necessary sometimes, aren't they? To make a point clear.
Absolutely. And this demonstrates a common pattern. When a general argument gets too abstract, you use specific examples to illustrate. But when a participant feels cornered or defensive, those examples can get twisted into perceived personal attacks.
Right. They take it personally instead of seeing the general principle.
Precisely. Kitani, again, defended herself clearly and logically. She explained her examples were merely for illustrative purposes, within a general argument, not tied exclusively to any one religion. She pointed out correctly that many religions might have claims like all life came from water, so it wasn't a targeted attack on Islam specifically.
It just highlights how specific examples, though necessary, are often mischaracterized by defensive people as tangents or attacks. It's a way to avoid the actual argument, maybe.
Often, yes. It shifts the focus away from the logic onto perceived slights. And the escalation continued from there, veering sharply into personal attacks. A classic ad hominem fallacy.
Okay, where did it go next?
When Kitani stated that, in her view, there are actually no religions that meet this criteria, the hypothetical one of making only true claims, Wolf Fangs pivoted immediately. He stopped arguing the point and started attacking her character and intelligence.
Oh, boy. What did he say?
He lashed out with things like, so you're familiar with every single religion on the planet. You should humble yourself.
Yeah.
You're not all-knowing. And then the kicker. Don't bring ChatGPT prompts as talking points, because I've debunked those like clockwork many times. Be creative.
ChatGPT prompts. That's a new one. Is that like a modern way of saying you sound like a robot or you're not thinking for yourself?
It absolutely feels like that.
Yeah.
And it's crucial to understand, dismissing someone's argument as ChatGPT generated isn't just a casual insult. It's a very modern yet still classic form of ad hominem.
How so?
It's an attempt to discredit the source, the person. rather than engaging with the substance of their argument. It avoids the actual intellectual labor required to rebut a complex, well-structured point. You just dismiss it as artificial.
Lazy debating, basically.
Fundamentally, yes. And Kitani, again, to her credit, she meticulously deconstructed these attacks in real time. She identified them. An inverted appeal to authority implying she needed to be a scholar to critique. A straw man fallacy, reframing her statement as a claim to be all-knowing when she was making a logical generalization based on available evidence.
Yeah.
And plain ad hominem by calling her arguments ChatGPT prompts.
And does she engage with the insults?
Nope. She refused, correctly stating they were irrelevant to the argument being made. That's a vital lesson, right? Don't get dragged down into the mud of personal insults. Stick to the logic.
So this whole first arc, what does it tell us, the observers trying to learn from this?
It shows a rapid descent. From what looked like an academic question into a mire of personal attacks, misrepresentation, outright dishonesty. Wolf Fangs refused to concede his lies, even after being caught. He even admitted to having skimmed through Kitani's detailed responses while simultaneously complaining about the technicality of words and accusing her of gaslighting.
Wait, he accused her of gaslighting after admitting he didn't even read her stuff properly and lied about his question.
The irony is thick, isn't it? The classic deflection. Projection, even. The accusation of gaslighting here is a prime example. It attempts to flip the script, turning the truthful observation of his own behavior, lying, not reading, into an attack by her. It's a hallmark of bad faith engagement.
Wow.
Kitani called out his dishonesty directly, pointing out his actions contradicted his claims of being a decent person. The exchange eventually just dissolved. Wolf Fangs disengaged, basically losing the debate by failing to make Kitani abandon her logical framework. His final shot.
You're the one who bugged me first. Get your brain checked.
Classy.
Quite. Kitani's final retort, you could feel the utter frustration. You're a lost cause. Stop bugging me, liar. It just illustrates how easily a debate can transform into just trading insults when one party throws the rules of rational discourse out the window.
Okay, so that was arc one. A complete breakdown. But then, it wasn't over. Not even close. Just when you thought that fire had burned out, a new contender entered the arena, seemingly from left field. Ieschouah 33, identified as a Gnostic.
And he picked up the baton.
He didn't just pick it up, he grabbed it and ran in a completely different and arguably even more frustrating direction. He immediately shifted the entire topic away from religious scientific claims to the very definition of atheism and the burden of proof.
Ah, the burden on who, namesake?
Precisely. His opening salvo set the stage for another protracted, deeply circular argument that consumed the thread for days, literally hundreds of posts. He started with, I think regarding atheism it should be, what are the proofs God doesn't exist if you are an atheist?
Okay, red flag right there. Demanding proof of a negative.
Huge red flag. His entrance immediately raised fundamental questions about the basic rules of engagement. He ignored core epistemological principles from the outset, particularly the burden of proof. He presented a series of what Kitani later, and rightly termed, foundational absurdities. First, and most crucially, as you noted, he completely shifted the burden of proof, demanding atheists prove God's non-existence. That's a classic logical fallacy. The burden always lies with the person making the positive claim, the one saying God exists, not the one expressing skepticism or lacking belief.
Right, it's that invisible purple unicorn in the garage analogy, isn't it? You don't have to prove the unicorn isn't there. The person claiming it is there needs to show the unicorn, or at least some hoof prints.
Exactly that. It's intuitive once you frame it that way. If you claim something extraordinary exists, the onus is on you to provide the extraordinary evidence.
What else? What other foundational absurdities?
Beyond that, he made a profound category error. He stated a false equivalence between science and religion, claiming religion and science aren't different. They're both one and the same.
Whoa. Okay, that's a big claim. And pretty clearly wrong, methodologically speaking.
Fundamentally wrong. Science is a methodology based on empirical observation, testing, falsifiability. Religion, while it informs worldviews, is often based on faith, revelation, tradition. Equating them is like saying painting and structural engineering are the same because both involve putting things together. Their aims, methods, validation criteria are just fundamentally distinct.
Okay, that's a big one. Anything else?
Yes, and this one was cruelly bizarre. He introduced a swear-to-God purity test. He demanded that atheists swear to God to uphold truth in the discussion, implying they were inherently dishonest if they refused.
Wait, demand atheists swear to God? How does that even work?
It doesn't. It's a non-starter. It was clearly designed to disqualify non-believers from the conversation from the outset, creating an impossible catch-22 barrier to entry for any meaningful discussion. If you don't believe in God, how can you swear to God sincerely? It's inherently contradictory.
So flawed premises right out of the gate. And Kitani.
Kitani, once again, took on the role of the relentless correction enforcer, like the thread's logical immune system, as you put it. She immediately honed in on the burden of proof issue, recognizing it as the foundational flaw. If that wasn't addressed, nothing else mattered.
She wouldn't let it slide?
Not for a second. She explained, patiently at first, that atheism, in its common modern usage, is simply a lack of belief in God. It's an epistemic position about what you know or are convinced of. Is not a positive claim that God does not exist, which would be an ontological claim, a statement about the actual nature of reality.
That distinction seems crucial. Lack of belief versus belief in non-existence.
Paramount. Absolutely paramount to understanding the entire debate around atheism.
Yeah.
And she used that crucial, memorable analogy to drive this point home. The Santa Claus one.
Yes. Tell us thou art.
She said, "It is not an extraordinary claim to lack belief in God, just as how I'm not convinced of Santa isn't."
That's brilliant. Simple. Clear.
It really cuts through the fog, doesn't it? It perfectly illustrates that the burden of proof lies squarely with the claimant, the theist asserting God's existence, just like the person asserting Santa's existence, not with the unconvinced atheist who simply lacks belief.
So she's saying, I'm not convinced is a perfectly valid default position until sufficient evidence is presented.
Precisely, and Kitani made it abundantly clear. She would not move on to discussing her reasons for lacking belief until Ieschouah conceded this fundamental point about the burden of proof. She knew that engaging further without settling, that would just validate his fallacious premise and lead to an endless, pointless loop.
Smart strategy. Hold the line on the fundamentals. But did Ieschouah concede?
Oh, absolutely not. He proved to be incredibly adept at deploying what we call the unkillable straw man fallacy.
The unkillable straw man. Explain that.
It's where an opponent repeatedly misrepresents your position, hammering away at a distorted version of your argument even after you've corrected them multiple times. It's like they build a straw version of you that's easy to knock down, and they just keep punching the straw man, ignoring the real you standing right there.
And how did Ieschouah do this?
He consistently, relentlessly misrepresented Kitani's actual position. I am not convinced God exists, twisting it into the positive claim God does not exist.
Even after she explained the difference.
Dozens of times. The logs are filled with it. Despite Kitani's explicit, repeated corrections, like literally typing out, not convinced God exists. God does not exist. He just kept hammering away at the fabricated claim, as if her corrections were invisible.
That sounds incredibly frustrating and deliberate.
It certainly appears deliberate. He even dismissed this critical distinction, the absolute heart of the logical disagreement, as just splitting hairs. That dismissal revealed either a willful ignorance or, more likely, a calculated tactic to avoid engaging with the point that completely dismantled his entire argument.
Because if he conceded the burden of proof was on him, his whole line of attack collapses.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's peak bad faith engagement. The goal clearly wasn't understanding. It was victory through misdirection and attrition.
And this is where the sealiening came into.
Yes, this ties directly into sealiening. For listeners unfamiliar, sealiening is a form of trolling where someone feigns ignorance and relentlessly asks repetitive questions, often very politely on the surface, while refusing to accept answers or preconditions. They essentially drown the conversation in a sea of repetitive, unhelpful inquiries.
Like a sea lion just barking the same question over and over.
Exactly. Ieschouah constantly demanded, so what's your reason? What's your reason for not believing in God? Despite Kitani explicitly stating repeatedly, I will provide reasons after you concede the burden of proof lies with the claimant.
He just ignored the condition.
Completely ignored it. And then, dishonestly, he framed her refusal to be derailed by his tactic as proof that she actually had no reasons. He literally said things like, you have zero reasons. It was a rhetorical bludgeon based on a lie.
Using her adherence to logical sequencing against her.
Wow. It's also a component of what's called a Gish gallop. You just throw out a barrage of demands, questions, accusations, without pausing to let any single point be properly addressed or resolved. The goal is to overwhelm and frustrate your opponent, not to engage in reasoned debate.
It sounds exhausting just hearing about it.
It was exhausting to read, let alone participate in. Jez's objective clearly wasn't to learn Kitani's reasons, but to use her refusal to play his faulty game as evidence against her. It's like a denial-of-service attack on the conversation itself.
So did anyone else step in? You mentioned the moderator, Novari LVX.
Yes, eventually the logic police arrive, as you called them earlier. Novari, the moderator, and also Willow the Satanist participant, tried to intervene. Novari, recognizing the completely circular nature of the argument, tried to patiently explain the burden of proof yet again.
What did Novari say?
Novari stated very clearly, not believing a claim isn't a claim, it is the absence of one. The burden stays with the person asserting, not the person unconvinced. Simple, direct.
And use an analogy, too.
Yes, another great one. Novari used the unicorn analogy. This is like demanding someone justify why they don't believe in unicorns. Not being convinced is the only necessary reason. Trying to cut through the semantic fog with a clear, relatable image.
Okay, surely that got through. Clear explanation, clear analogy.
You would think. But what was truly frustrating and incredibly illustrative of Ieschouah's, let's call it deliberate obtuseness, was his immediate illogical twist of Novari's perfectly clear words.
What did he do?
He completely ignored the point or twisted it, responding, correct. The person making a claim God doesn't exist has to justify it. He took Novari's explanation of why the atheist doesn't bear the burden and immediately shoehorned it back into his original flawed premise that the atheist is making that claim.
Unbelievable. He just could not or would not grasp the core distinction.
It seemed willful. Novari's exasperation was palpable in their reply. No, you either lack basic reading comprehension, are being deliberately obtuse, or are simply a troll.
Harsh, but understandable given the context.
Completely. There was one fleeting moment reading the logs where Ieschouah seemed almost to grasp it. He asked something like, so if I say I'm not convinced God doesn't exist, that means I don't need to provide proof, which is close to the principle.
Okay, a glimmer of hope.
A glimmer, immediately extinguished. He instantly used that flicker of understanding not to concede the point about the atheist's position, but to try and play a semantic gotcha game. It just proved his intent wasn't genuine engagement with the logic. He was looking for loopholes and rhetorical tricks, not mutual understanding.
So, stuck in this endless loop about who has to prove what, did he ever actually try to offer his own proofs for God?
He did attempt to, yes. While still stuck in the burden of proof argument, refusing to concede the point, he tried to pivot and offer his proofs for God's existence.
But Kitani and the others wouldn't engage with those proofs.
Largely, no, because the foundational logical rules were never agreed upon. The conversation couldn't logically move forward to actually critique his evidence when he refused to accept the basic framework for evaluating claims. It's like trying to discuss the physics of a building's collapse when one person refuses to accept gravity exists.
Right. You can't even start the analysis. So what were these proofs he offered?
Oh, they were. Quite something. A fascinating blend of anecdote, misunderstanding of science, and logical fallacies.
Lay them on us.
Okay, first, he cited anecdotal near-death experiences, NDEs, and out-of-body experiences as proof of the soul.
Which are subjective experiences, right? With lots of potential non-supernatural explanations.
Exactly. Neurology, psychology, oxygen deprivation. There are many scientific avenues exploring NDEs without resorting to souls. Second, he profoundly misinterpreted the second law of thermodynamics.
Ah, classic target for pseudoscience. What did he claim?
He claimed it showed energy never dies, but just transitions to other planes of conscious experience. It was just a complete bastardization of a fundamental law of physics about entropy, heat flow, and the tendency towards disorder. It has nothing to do with consciousness or afterlife planes.
Wow. Okay, what else?
He also made a classic argument from ignorance regarding planetary movement. He attributed it to a world soul or ether because, as he put it, you don't see gravity.
So because he can't see gravity directly, it must be a soul. That's quite a leap.
It's a textbook fallacy. I can't explain X, therefore Y must be true. We can explain planetary motion through gravity, even if we don't see the force itself. We see its effects and can model it mathematically with incredible precision.
Any other proofs?
He also tried to use vague generalities, like claiming all religions have a creation story talking about the Big Bang, which is a gross oversimplification and often inaccurate representation of both diverse religious creation myths and modern cosmological science.
So a collection of flawed arguments based on anecdote, misapplied science, and logical fallacies.
Pretty much. And what this cluster of proofs really reflects, especially given his unwavering confidence, is a profound Dunning-Kruger effect.
Where low competence leads to high confidence.
Exactly. An individual's confidence in their knowledge far outstrips their actual understanding, leading them to confidently assert demonstrably false claims. And because the conversation literally couldn't move past his refusal to accept basic logical ground rules, he was essentially left shouting into the void, repeating, "You have zero reasons," in an echo chamber of his own making. It's a perfect illustration of a debate going absolutely nowhere because one party refused to even agree on the rules of the game.
This whole deep dive into the burden on who debate, it really is a masterclass in online dishonesty, isn't it? Let's really break down the specific tactics used by Wolf Fangs and Ieschouah 33. Because understanding these maneuvers is just key to navigating any contentious discussion, online or off.
Absolutely. Recognizing these patterns can save you so much time and frustration. Forewarned is forearmed, as they say.
So let's start with Wolf Fangs. You characterize him as the defensive reframer. What was his main tactic?
His most significant act of dishonesty, the one that really poisoned the well for the rest of that conversation, was what we call the foundational lie. Retroactively modifying his question.
Right, the part where he claimed his question was different after Kitani answered it.
Exactly. After Kitani provided that comprehensive answer to his general query about scientific claims in religion, Wolf Fangs falsely claimed his actual original question was far more specific. He said, "Okay, but if a religion makes only true, empirically verifiable claims, that was my question."
And Kitani busted him with the quotes.
She did. Immediately fact-checked him, quoting both his actual general original question and his newly fabricated specific one side by side. It was undeniable.
And this wasn't just a mistake, you argue, it was a tactic.
It really looks like a calculated move. By pretending his question was different, he tried to invalidate Kitani's entire detailed argument. The goal seemed to be framing her as someone who made incorrect assumptions rather than someone who accurately answered the question he actually posed. It's a bad faith move to try and regain rhetorical high ground and shift blame for where the conversation went.
Classic misdirection. What else did he do?
He also frequently resorted to ad hominem attacks and dismissive rhetoric. When he couldn't logically refute Kitani's points about, say, the lack of religions meeting his hypothetical criteria, he pivoted. He attacked her character, her intelligence.
So humble yourself. You're not all knowing stuff.
Yes, and trying to undermine her credibility by implying she needed to be a scholar on Sikhism just to speak on general religious claims. And of course, dismissing her well-reasoned arguments as ChatGPT prompts.
That bizarre be creative line.
Right. It's not just rude. It's a tactic. Avoid the intellectual labor of refutation by simply insulting the source or dismissing the format. He even complained her detailed responses were too long-winded, saying, "Oh my God, bruh, ChatGPT make this 3 sentences." Demanding brevity precisely because her detailed points were hard for him to counter.
So attack the person, attack the style, attack the length, anything but attack the argument itself.
That's the pattern. And his final tactic, which showed remarkable bad faith, was willful ignorance and feigning victimhood.
How did that play out?
He openly admitted to not reading all of this or having only skimmed through it, and then, almost immediately after admitting that, he accused Kitani of gaslighting him when she pointed out his unread responses and inconsistencies.
The projection again. Accusing her of gaslighting while actively doing things that fit the definition.
It's a classic deflection. Flip the script. Turn the truthful observation of your own behavior into an attack by the other party. He complained about the conversation being useless and annoying, while simultaneously being the primary cause of its dysfunction through his refusal to engage sincerely. It's a way to disengage while trying to claim some kind of moral high ground or victim status.
Okay, so Wolf Fangs. Retroactive reframing, ad hominem, willful ignorance, feigned victimhood. Got it. Now, Ieschouah 33. If Wolf Fangs was subtle misdirection, you called Ieschouah a wrecking ball.
That feels accurate. His participation was just a relentless onslaught of fallacies, a full frontal assault. His entire entry was built on foundational absurdities and category errors.
The burden of proof shift? Science equals religion?
Exactly. His very first post contained these demonstrable false claims based on widely accepted philosophical and scientific definitions, shifting the burden onto atheists to prove God's non-existence textbook fallacy, the category error of equating religion and science, fundamentally misunderstanding both.
And the swear to God test.
And the utterly bizarre swear-to-God sincerity test, designed to invalidate non-believers from the get-go. These aren't just differing opinions. They're fundamentally flawed premises that make genuine dialogue impossible. They function as intellectual roadblocks from step one.
And his primary weapon.
The unkillable straw man, the God doesn't exist claim. He wielded this hundreds of times, despite Kitani and Davari correcting him literally dozens, probably scores of times. He willfully and repeatedly misrepresented her position of, I am not convinced God exists, as a positive claim that God does not exist.
It's like he couldn't hear the correction or just chose not to.
He absolutely chose not to. He even dismissed the critical distinction, the difference between lacking belief and believing in a negative, as merely splitting hairs. That confirmed his deliberate obfuscation. He understood the distinction but ignored it because it undermined his entire rhetorical strategy. He wanted to force atheists into the logically impossible position of proving a negative.
So it wasn't ignorance, it was strategy. A dishonest one.
It appears so. Designed not to understand, but to trap and exhaust. Which leads directly to the ceiling and blatant trolling.
The endless what's your reason?
Relentlessly.
Yeah.
Feigning ignorance, endlessly asking repetitive questions, ignoring the answers or the preconditions Kitani had clearly laid out, concede the burden of proof first, then we discuss reasons. He just ignored that, hammered, what's your reason, and then used her refusal to be derailed as proof she had zero reasons.
That's the Gish-Gallop component too, right? Overwhelmed with demands.
Exactly. Barrage them with questions, accusations, demands, never pausing to let a single point land or be resolved. It's designed to exhaust and frustrate, not enlighten. That momentary glimmer of understanding he showed, followed instantly by a semantic game, just underscored his lack of genuine engagement. He wasn't looking for answers. He was looking for ways to trip Kitani up.
And finally, his own proofs were just bad.
To put it mildly, utterly absurd pseudoscience and factually bankrupt claims, misusing the second law of thermodynamics for soul transitioning. The argument from ignorance about planetary motion and a world soul because you can't see gravity. Relying on anecdotal NDEs as hard proof, grossly oversimplifying creation myths and cosmology.
It's a greatest hits of bad arguments.
It really is. And delivered with that Dunning-Kruger level of confidence. His arguments were left hanging, largely unaddressed by Kitani and Davari, because the core conversation couldn't move past his fundamental refusal to engage with basic logic. He wasn't really a participant in the conversation. He was an obstacle to it, creating his own isolated echo chamber where only his flawed logic could survive.
Okay, so we've dissected the tactics of dishonesty. But in this intellectual mosh pit, Kitani emerges as this fascinating and frankly almost heroic figure in context, the defender of logic. Her role and her rebuttal tactics are a huge takeaway here.
Absolutely. Her entire approach was about enforcing logical rigor above all else. That was her North Star throughout the whole chaotic exchange.
She just wouldn't budge on the fundamentals.
Nope. Her consistent, unwavering focus on definitional precision and adherence to logical principles, that was her defining characteristic. She wasn't just arguing her position, atheism, she was arguing for the very rules of argumentation itself.
Like an intellectual anchor or a gatekeeper against fallacies, as we said.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's why she was so persistent, sometimes frustratingly so to her opponents, in demanding concessions on foundational points like the burden of proof before moving on. She understood correctly that without shared logical ground rules, no productive discussion could possibly occur. It's like trying to play chess when one person insists the pawn can move backward. You have to stop, point to the rulebook, and agree on how the pieces move first.
But she faced a ton of criticism for her style, didn't she? Too long-winded ChatGPT prompts. How do we evaluate those criticisms looking at the whole picture?
Well, the chat logs themselves provide ample defense. Were her posts lengthy? Yes, often very. But they were necessarily so. She was responding meticulously to multiple layered errors, misrepresentations, and fallacies from her opponents. Each point often required a detailed, point-by-point refutation to avoid being misunderstood or having her own points twisted later.
So a quick, snappy reply just wouldn't have cut it.
Not against that kind of gish-gallop and straw-manning. A two-sentence reply, as Wolf Fangs demanded, would have been utterly insufficient and easily misrepresented. The ChatGPT accusation. Pure ad hominem. A baseless insult meant to dismiss her well-structured, human-written arguments without actually engaging their substance. She rightly called it out, stating clearly, everything I sent you was human-written. It's just a lazy way to imply lack of genuine thought.
Okay, what about the accusations of dodging questions or arguing in bad faith? Wolf Fangs called her an Olympic runner for not immediately answering everything he threw at her. That feels like a common jab online.
It is, and it's often a mischaracterization of sound debate strategy. Looking at the logs, she wasn't dodging. She was sequencing. She was insisting on resolving one critical point, the burden of proof, before allowing a pivot to another topic, like her personal reasons for atheism.
Why is that important?
It's a legitimate strategy to prevent being gish-galloped or led down endless, irrelevant rabbit holes. She explicitly stated her methodology multiple times. We can talk about the reasoning after you have conceded that the burden of proof is not on the atheist, and we do one topic at a time. Gish-gallops are the tool of the rhetorically dishonest. That's not bad faith. That's enforcing good faith by preventing logical chaos. She was saying, let's fix the foundation before we try to build the walls.
Makes sense. Put first things first. Now, what about her tone? She was called impolite, aggressive. Her final retort to Wolf Fangs, liar, lost cause, was pretty sharp. Was that justified?
Her tone undeniably escalated over time, no question. But the logs clearly show this wasn't unprovoked aggression. It was a direct response to the increasing dishonesty, the constant misrepresentation, the ad hominem attacks, and, frankly, the sheer brick wall frustration she faced.
Context matters.
Hugely. She started the conversation with Wolf Fangs politely, offering a detailed, academic answer. Her sharpest language, using words like liar, troll, disingenuous, was reserved specifically for moments when she was presenting direct, quote, based evidence of her opponent's falsehoods and their outright refusal to engage honestly. In that context, her impoliteness arguably becomes a necessary tool.
How so?
It's a way to signal the complete breakdown of good faith discourse when subtler methods have failed repeatedly. It's a way to refuse to normalize blatant dishonesty. Sometimes direct, unambiguous language is the only way left to cut through deliberate obfuscation and bad faith. It wasn't random aggression. It was targeted pushback against specific, documented bad behavior.
Okay. And the most persistent lie against her, especially from Ieschouah, was that she had zero reasons for her atheism, or that she wasn't credible because she wasn't a scholar. How blatant was that fabrication?
The zero reasons claim was perhaps the most blatant, easily disprovable fabrication of the entire debate. Kitani explicitly stated, and the logs show it clearly on at least 9 separate occasions that we counted, that she did have reasons for her atheism.
So why didn't she share them?
Her refusal to immediately share them wasn't because she lacked them. It was because she was sticking to her logical guns, insisting on resolving the fundamental burden of proof issue first. It was a tactical, logical choice, entirely consistent with her framework, not an admission of ignorance or lack of substance. As we said, it's like refusing to debate the color of the unicorn's horn before agreeing if there's even a unicorn in the room.
Right. Sequence matters. And the not a scholar, ad hominem.
She simply dismissed it, as she should have. She correctly pointed out, one doesn't need to be an expert theologian or scholar of every single religion to identify a basic logical flaw or an empirical falsehood within a specific claim made by any religion. You don't need a PhD in leprechaun studies to be skeptical of claims about pots of gold at the end of rainbows.
Good point.
Ultimately, what Kitani demonstrates throughout this whole ordeal is the critical importance of intellectual integrity in any debate. She wasn't just arguing a position. She was defending the very rules of rational discourse itself. Her concede this first stance, while obviously infuriating to her opponents who wanted to dictate the terms, was a legitimate and necessary strategy to prevent endless, unproductive, circular arguments based on faulty premises. She kept trying to bring it back to logic.
So wrapping this deep dive up, you've just journeyed with us through the messy, fascinating, and often deeply frustrating world of online debate. We've dissected those 2 main arcs. The attempt to use supposed scientific claims as religious evidence, and that prolonged, grinding battle over the fundamental burden of proof and the definition of atheism.
And through it all, we've seen this clear anatomy of dishonesty laid bare, haven't we? From the subtle misrepresentations and retroactive reframing by Wolf Fangs to the blatant, relentless trolling, the unkillable straw men, and the pseudoscience deployed by Ieschouah 33.
It's a really powerful reminder, I think, that sometimes the biggest obstacles in communication aren't simply differing opinions or beliefs. Sometimes it's fundamentally different approaches to truth itself. It's a disagreement or maybe even a disregard for the basic rules of rational engagement.
Absolutely. This deep dive truly highlights the profound challenges we face trying to communicate across different logical frameworks, different belief systems, especially in these online environments where anonymity can sometimes, unfortunately, embolden bad faith actors.
So what's the takeaway for you, the listener?
It underscores the vital importance of critical thinking, of always insisting on definitional clarity. What do we actually mean by the words we're using? And crucially, being able to identify these bad faith tactics, the straw men, the ad hominems, the gish gallops, the ceiling in any informational exchange you encounter, whether it's on Discord, social media, or even in a work meeting.
Yeah, understanding these maneuvers isn't just about winning an argument online, right? It's much bigger than that.
It's about safeguarding productive discourse itself. It's about not letting conversations be derailed by those who refuse to play by the rules of reason and evidence.
So as you reflect on the dynamics we've explored today, the attacks, the defenses, the breakdowns, and maybe think about your own experiences and discussions, online or off, it leaves us with a question, doesn't it? What responsibilities do we, as participants and observers, have to uphold the standards of rational discourse, especially when we're faced with clearly disingenuous behavior?
That's a tough one. Is it always worth engaging? Does engaging sometimes just feed the trolls, validating their tactics? Or is there a point where strategic disengagement becomes the more rational, the more self-preserving choice?
Yeah.
How do we build bridges of understanding when the very foundations of logic are being contested or ignored?
Heavy questions.
They are. And maybe in this era of just constant information overload, endless online arguments, perhaps understanding the underlying tactics of debate, both the good and the bad, the honest and the dishonest, maybe that is the most valuable skill you can cultivate right now for navigating the complex intellectual landscape all around you.
And knowing when to walk away.
And perhaps the hardest yet most crucial skill within that is developing the wisdom to recognize when a debate is no longer a collaborative search for truth, however contentious, but has simply devolved into an exercise in futility or rhetorical combat. And knowing then when to disengage, not in defeat, but for the sake of your own intellectual well-being and the preservation of meaningful discourse elsewhere.